She walked into the bank with nothing but hope. A simple woman clutching a worn folder, her dreams resting on a single loan application. But the manager didn't see her as a person. He saw her as a joke. "Do you even know how loans work?" he sneered, his voice dripping with arrogance. The humiliation was relentless. Her modest clothes, her polite tone, all mocked by his condescending smirk. She was just another nobody to him. What he didn't realize, though, was that this nobody wasn't alone. And when he finally learned who her husband was, it would be too late. Emily Dawson sat frozen in her chair, staring at the polished mahogany desk that separated her from the man who had just dismissed her dreams with a single wave of his hand. Mr. Carter, the bank manager, leaned back in his leather chair, his smirk radiating an air of superiority that stung more than his words. To him, Emily wasn't a person. She was a problem, a risk, a nuisance that didn't fit neatly into his world of spreadsheets and profit margins. "Mrs. Dawson," he said, his tone dripping with condescension, "you have to understand how this works. Banks don't invest in pipe dreams. You want money to expand your business, but what guarantees do we have? Handmade furniture? It's not scalable, it's not efficient, and frankly, it's not worth the risk." Emily tried to respond, her voice trembling but steady. "We've built a loyal customer base. People appreciate quality craftsmanship. We just need the resources to grow." But Mr. Carter interrupted her again, this time with an exaggerated sigh as if her words were wasting his precious time. "Loyal customers don't pay the bills, Mrs. Dawson. Numbers do. And your numbers, well, let's just say they don't inspire confidence." The humiliation was palpable. Emily felt the weight of every judgmental glance from the bank employees passing by the glass-walled office. She could see them whispering to each other, their eyes flicking toward her like she was some sort of spectacle, a woman out of her depth in a place she didn't belong. Mr. Carter wasn't finished. He picked up her folder and flipped through it carelessly without even reading the contents. "You're asking for a substantial loan," he said, tossing the folder back onto the desk as though it were garbage. "But you don't have the assets to back it up. You don't have the experience to justify it. And frankly," he paused for effect, leaning forward with a smirk that made Emily's stomach churn, "I don't think you understand how business works." Emily's cheeks burned with shame and anger as she struggled to keep her composure. She wanted to shout at him, to defend herself and her husband's hard work. But what good would it do? He had already made up his mind about her before she even walked through the door. This wasn't just about her business proposal. It was about power. His power over people like her. People who didn't fit into his narrow view of success and worthiness. For Mr. Carter, this was routine, a daily exercise in asserting dominance over those he deemed inferior. He thrived on moments like these, belittling small business owners who dared to dream beyond their means, crushing their hopes, under the weight of his authority. And Emily wasn't alone in this experience. Across the country, small business owners face similar struggles every day, dismissed by banks that saw them as liabilities rather than opportunities. Entrepreneurs poured their hearts into their ventures only to be met with hidden fees, complex loan terms, and outright discrimination when seeking financial support. Women like Emily were often judged not just by their business plans, but by their appearances, their clothes, their demeanor, as if these superficial details defined their ability to succeed. Even worse were the stories of minority entrepreneurs who came prepared with impeccable financial profiles and strong credit scores, only to be offered inferior loan products or denied altogether. The bias wasn't always overt. It was subtle, insidious, but its impact was devastating nonetheless. Banks held all the cards in these interactions. They controlled access to capital, dictated terms, and wielded market power that left small businesses vulnerable. For many entrepreneurs like Emily and her husband, one rejection could mean the difference between survival and failure. Emily had heard these stories before, stories of hard-working people being crushed under the weight of bureaucracy and greed. But she never thought she'd become one herself. And yet here she was, sitting across from a man who saw her dreams as nothing more than an inconvenience. Mr. Carter leaned back again, clearly satisfied with himself as he delivered his final blow. My advice? Stick to what you know and leave business to people who can handle it. Emily felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but refused to let them fall. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. Instead, she gathered her folder and stood up slowly, forcing herself to meet his gaze one last time before turning toward the door. As she walked out of his office and back into the bustling lobby filled with polished marble floors and gleaming glass walls, she felt a mix of emotions swirling inside. Her anger, humiliation, despair. But beneath it all, there was something else, something stronger, something that Mr. Carter hadn't counted on, because while he had spent the last 20 minutes tearing her down, he had no idea who he was really dealing with, and soon enough, he would learn just how wrong he was. Emily stepped out of the bank, the heavy glass door closing behind her with a finality that felt like a slap. The world outside seemed indifferent to her humiliation. People bustled past, cars honked in the distance, and the sun blazed overhead as if mocking her. She clutched the folder to her chest, its contents now feeling like a cruel joke. A collection of dreams and plans that had been so easily dismissed by a man who didn't even bother to look at them. Her legs felt like lead as she made her way to the small bench by the sidewalk. She sank down, staring blankly at the folder in her lap. The sting of Mr. Carter's words replayed in her mind on an endless loop. Stick to what you know. Leave business to people who can handle it. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them away, refusing to cry in public. She couldn't afford to fall apart. Not here, not now. But inside, she felt like a dam was about to break. How had it come to this? How had she ended up sitting on a bench outside a bank that had just crushed everything she and her husband had worked so hard for? Her thoughts drifted back to the early days of their business. She and David, the love of her life, had started with nothing but a shared dream and a determination to make it work. David's hands were magic with wood. He could take an old, forgotten piece of timber and transform it into something beautiful, something that told a story. Emily handled the rest: marketing, customer relations, bookkeeping. Together, they had built something they were proud of, but pride didn't pay. Bills. And lately, the bills had been piling up faster than they could manage. They needed this loan, not just for their business, but for their family, for their 2 young children who deserved stability and security, for their future. Emily's chest tightened as the weight of it all pressed down on her. She thought about David, who was probably at home right now working on another order, completely unaware of how badly things had gone at the bank. How was she supposed to tell him? How was she supposed to look him in the eye and admit that she had failed? For a moment, despair threatened to consume her. Maybe Mr. Carter was right. Maybe she didn't understand how business worked. Maybe they were foolish for thinking they could compete in a world dominated by mass production and cheap imports. Maybe their dream really was just a pipe dream. But then, something shifted. As Emily sat there on that bench, staring at the folder, in her lap, she began to realize something important, something Mr. Carter would never understand. This wasn't just about money or loans or business plans. This was about people, about heart and soul and hard work, about creating something real in a world that often valued convenience over quality. Mr. Carter hadn't rejected their business. He had rejected her. He had looked at her clothes, her demeanor, her lack of formal education, and decided she wasn't worth his time. He hadn't even opened the folder to see what they had accomplished or what they were capable of achieving. And that wasn't just unfair. It was infuriating. Emily's grip on the folder tightened as anger began to replace despair. She thought about all the late nights she and David had spent working until their hands were raw and their backs ached. She thought about their customers, the ones who sent heartfelt messages thanking them for creating furniture that brought warmth and character into their homes. She thought about her children, their innocent faces lighting up every time they saw a new piece completed in their father's workshop. And then she thought about Mr. Carter, his smug smile, his dismissive tone. And something inside her snapped. No, she wasn't going to let one arrogant man dictate their future. Emily stood, up from the bench with renewed determination coursing through her veins. She didn't have all the answers yet. She didn't know exactly how they were going to overcome this setback. But one thing was certain. She wasn't giving up. She pulled out her phone and dialed David's number. He answered on the second ring, his voice warm and familiar. "Hey, Em," he said cheerfully. "How did it go?" Emily hesitated for half a second before answering. "Not great." There was a pause on the other end of the line before David spoke again, his tone gentle, but firm. "We'll figure it out." And in that moment, Emily knew he was right. They would figure it out. Together. Because while Mr. Carter might have all the power inside his glass-walled office, he didn't have what they had: resilience, passion, and an unshakable belief in each other. Emily ended the call with a promise to be home soon and started walking toward her car with purpose in her stride. As she drove away from the bank, an idea began to form in her mind, an idea that would change everything. Mr. Carter thought he held all the cards, but he was about to learn just how wrong he was, because Emily Dawson wasn't done fighting, not by a long shot, and neither was her husband. Their story wasn't over yet, it was just beginning, and when it came time for Mr. Carter to face the consequences of his arrogance, Emily would make sure he never forgot it. Emily Dawson stood in her modest kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence as she stared at the folder on the counter. It had been days since her humiliating encounter with Mr. Carter, but the sting of his words hadn't faded. Every time she closed her eyes, she could hear his condescending tone. "Stick to what you know." The rejection wasn't just a financial blow, it was personal. He hadn't judged her business, he had judged her. David, her husband, walked in, wiping sawdust from his hands, his face lined with concern. "You've been quiet," he said gently, his voice breaking through her thoughts. Emily hesitated before answering. I keep thinking about what he said, how he looked at me like I didn't belong." David frowned, his jaw tightening. "He doesn't know you, Em. He doesn't know us." But Emily shook her head. "It's not just him. It's people like him. The ones who think they're better than everyone else because they sit behind a desk and wear expensive suits. They think they can decide who deserves a chance and who doesn't." David placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll figure it out. We always do." Emily nodded, but deep down she knew this wasn't something they could simply figure out. They needed more than resilience. They needed a plan. And as she stared at the folder filled with their business projections and customer testimonials, an idea began to take shape in her mind. An idea that would turn their fortunes around and prove Mr. Carter wrong in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. The next morning, Emily sat at her desk with determination burning in her chest. She began researching alternative funding options, small business grants, community programs, anything that could help them bypass the traditional banking system that had failed them so miserably. She reached out to local organizations and even drafted an email to a crowdfunding platform, explaining their story and their vision for the future. But as she worked tirelessly, another thought lingered in the back of her mind. A thought she couldn't shake no matter how hard she tried. Who does Mr. Carter think he is? It wasn't just about the loan anymore. It was about justice. About standing up to someone who had wielded his power like a weapon to belittle and humiliate her. And then it hit her. A memory from years ago when David had mentioned something, during dinner, about the ownership structure of the bank chain where Mr. Carter worked. "David!" Emily called out suddenly, walking into his workshop where he was sanding down a beautiful oak table. He looked up from his work, surprised by her urgency. "What's going on?" "The bank," she said quickly. "The one where Mr. Carter works. It's part of a chain, right?" David nodded slowly. Yeah. Why? You said something. Once about who owns it. David's brow furrowed as he tried to recall. Oh, yeah. It's owned by a private equity firm, or at least part of it is. But there's also an individual investor who has majority control. Emily's heart raced as she pressed further. Do you remember who? David shrugged casually, unaware of the storm brewing inside his wife's mind. I think it's James Whittaker. Emily froze at the name. A name she knew well because James Whittaker wasn't just an investor. He was David's longtime mentor and close friend. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. The arrogance of Mr. Carter, his dismissive attitude towards small business owners like herself. All of it was rooted in ignorance because he didn't know who he was dealing with. But Emily did. That evening, Emily sat across from David at their dining table, her hands trembling. Slightly as she explained her plan. I'm going to call James, she said firmly. David raised an eyebrow but didn't interrupt. I'm going to tell him exactly what happened, how Mr. Carter treated me, and I'm going to ask him if this is how he wants his bank chain represented. David leaned back, in his chair, studying her carefully before speaking. You really think James will get involved? Emily nodded without hesitation. I know he will. David smiled faintly, but didn't argue further, because deep down, he knew Emily was right. The next morning, Emily made the call. James Whittaker answered on the second ring, his voice warm and familiar, despite the years that had passed since they'd last spoken. Emily, he greeted cheerfully. It's been too long. It has, Emily agreed, before diving straight into the reason for her call. She recounted every detail of her interaction with Mr. Carter, the humiliation, the dismissal, and explained how it wasn't just about her, but about countless other small business owners who were treated unfairly by people like him. When she finished speaking, there was silence on the other end of the line for several moments before James responded. That's unacceptable, he said finally, his tone sharp with disapproval. I thought you should know, Emily replied carefully, because I don't think this reflects well on your brand or your values. James sighed heavily before answering again. Leave it with me. 2 weeks later, Emily received an unexpected call from Mr. Carter himself. His voice was noticeably different from their last interaction, hesitant and nervous instead of arrogant and condescending. Mrs. Dawson, he began awkwardly. I wanted to apologize for our previous meeting. Emily raised an eyebrow but said nothing as he continued stumbling over his words. It seems I may have misjudged your proposal, he admitted reluctantly, before adding, We'd like to revisit your application. Emily suppressed a smile as she replied calmly, I appreciate that. What Mr. Carter didn't say, but what Emily already knew, was that James Whittaker had intervened personally to address the situation after learning about how one of his employees had treated a valued connection like Emily Dawson. The reversal was complete, and while Mr. Carter might have thought this was simply about approving a loan application, Emily knew better. This wasn't just about business. It was about standing up for herself and proving that even those who seemed powerless could turn the tables when armed with determination and just a little bit of leverage. As Emily hung up the phone that day, she felt something she hadn't felt in weeks. Triumph, not just for herself, but for every small business owner who had ever been underestimated or dismissed by people like Mr. Carter. Because now, they weren't just surviving, they were winning. And nothing felt better than that. The phone call had come and gone, but Emily Dawson's victory didn't end there. Mr. Carter's sudden change of heart was only the beginning of the poetic justice that was about to unfold. While Emily had been gracious in accepting his apology and agreeing to revisit her loan application, she knew that karma had a way of working its magic, and this time it wasn't going to spare him. 2 days after Mr. Carter's grovelling phone call, Emily received an email from James Whittaker himself. It wasn't just a message of support, it was an invitation. James wanted to meet with her and David to discuss their business plans in detail. He had seen their proposal, read their testimonials, and was impressed by their vision. More importantly, he wanted to ensure that small businesses like theirs received the respect and opportunities they deserved, not just from his bank chain, but from the industry as a whole. When Emily and David arrived at the meeting, James greeted them warmly, his handshake firm and reassuring. He listened intently as they explained their goals for expansion, their commitment to quality craftsmanship, and their desire to create jobs in their community. By the end of the meeting, James made them an offer they couldn't refuse. Not only would he personally guarantee their loan approval, but he would also connect them with other investors who shared his passion for supporting small businesses. It was more than they had ever hoped for, and yet it felt like exactly what they deserved. Meanwhile, back at the bank's headquarters, Mr. Carter wasn't faring quite as well. James Whittaker's intervention hadn't stopped at approving Emily's loan. It had sparked a full-scale review of the bank's management practices. Word of Mr. Carter's behavior had spread quickly. Among senior executives, many of whom were appalled by his treatment of customers, complaints that had previously gone unnoticed were suddenly being revisited, and patterns began to emerge. Arrogance, dismissiveness, and a consistent failure to uphold the bank's values. Within weeks, Mr. Carter found himself under scrutiny, not just for his interaction with Emily, but for his overall conduct as a manager. Employees who had once stayed silent now came forward with stories of his condescending remarks and unfair treatment. Customers shared similar experiences on social media, painting a picture of a man who had let his position go to his head. The fallout was swift and decisive. Mr. Carter was summoned to a disciplinary hearing where he was confronted with evidence of his misconduct. His attempts to defend himself fell flat. There were too many witnesses, too many complaints, and too much damage done to the bank's reputation. By the end of the hearing, he was stripped of his title and offered two choices: resign quietly or face termination. For a man who had built his identity around power and prestige, the humiliation was unbearable. He chose resignation, but left the building with his head hanging low, a far cry from the arrogant smirk he had worn during his meeting with Emily Dawson. As for Emily and David, their lives transformed almost overnight. With James Whittaker's backing and newfound connections in the business world, they were able to secure not just the loan they needed, but additional funding that allowed them to expand beyond their wildest dreams. They hired skilled workers from their community, opened a larger workshop, and even launched an online store that brought their handcrafted furniture to customers across the country. But success wasn't just measured in financial terms. It was felt in every piece they created, every customer they served, and every moment they spent building something meaningful together. Emily often thought about Mr. Carter during those moments, not out of spite, but as a reminder of how far she had come. She didn't need revenge because justice had already been served. He had lost everything he valued, his position, his reputation, while she had gained something far greater: dignity, respect, and proof that perseverance could triumph over arrogance. One afternoon, as Emily stood in their bustling workshop watching David put the finishing touches on a beautiful walnut dining table, she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, not just for their success, but for the journey that had led them there. She thought about all the people who faced similar struggles, people who were underestimated because of their background or dismissed because they didn't fit someone else's idea of success, and she vowed never to forget what it felt like to be in their shoes. Because if there was one lesson she had learned through it all, it was this: power isn't about titles or wealth or status. It's about resilience, integrity, and believing in yourself even when others don't. And sometimes it's about knowing when to fight back. Months later, Emily received one final piece of poetic closure, an article in the local paper detailing Mr. Carter's downfall. The story outlined how his behavior had led to widespread changes within the bank chain, including new policies designed to ensure fair treatment for all customers, regardless of their background or appearance. Emily smiled as she read the article, not because she reveled in Mr. Carter's failure, but because she knew her experience had sparked something bigger than herself. In standing up for her dreams and refusing to let one man's arrogance define her worth, she had helped pave the way for change that would benefit countless others. And that was justice at its finest. As Emily closed the newspaper and returned to her workbench alongside David, she felt a quiet sense of pride, not just in what they had built, but in who they had become through it all. Stronger, wiser, and unshakably united. Their story wasn't just one of triumph. It was a testament to what could happen when ordinary people refused to back down against extraordinary odds. And while Mr. Carter might have thought he held all the power, Emily Dawson proved that true strength comes from within, and sometimes it changes everything.